Remove her before the donors see her. My father said it loudly enough for the receptionist, the florist, and the 2 volunteers arranging name cards beneath the brass Morrow House sign to hear every word. He pointed at me as if I were a spill someone had forgotten to clean from the entry tile. I was standing beside the front desk in black trousers, a cream work shirt, and the flat shoes I wore whenever I expected to spend 12 hours solving other people's problems. There was a streak of dust on one sleeve from the service stairwell. My hair was pinned back with a pencil because I had been helping Malik move a portable bar before the afternoon donor preview began. My father saw the pencil first, then he looked at the shoes. "That employee is not dressed for this room," he told Malik. "You need to have standards." Malik Reed did not look at me for permission to defend me. He looked at me because he knew the difference between a guest complaint and an ownership decision, and because the event schedule was already tight. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "this is a private donor preview. If there is a concern about a guest, I can review the event policy." "I am not asking you to review anything," my father said. "I am asking you to get the manager." "I am the manager," Malik replied. My mother, Judith, stood behind my father with a cream folder tucked against her ribs. She wore a navy dress, a strand of pearls, and the expression she used when she was about to make an insult sound like housekeeping advice. "Malik," she said, "you know who we are. We have supported this property for years." That was true in the way a person can claim to have supported a restaurant because they once attended a dinner there. My parents had brought donors to Morrow House after I bought it. They had recommended the old ballroom to friends. They had talked about the inn as if their invitations had built the walls. But support was not ownership. A familiar name was not a signature, and no amount of civic confidence could turn my father's opinion into a venue policy. The main gala was scheduled for 7:30 that evening. The afternoon event was a donor preview and setup reception, a narrow window and foundation sponsors could inspect the ballroom, meet the caterer, and see the printed program before the evening crowd arrived. It was supposed to be calm. The final vendor confirmations were due by 5. Instead, my father was trying to remove me from my own lobby. On a table beside the sign-in cards lay a glossy program for the Brooks Family Futures Foundation Gala. I picked it up because the cover showed Clara's photograph beneath the line about community partnership. I turned to the inside page. Morrow House Ballroom, donated. Hospitality staff, donated. Kitchen preparation, security, floral staging and morning reset, donated by the Brooks family. I read the page twice. The building was mine. The staff were not a family gift, and the phrase morning reset made my stomach tighten because a paying wedding was scheduled for the following afternoon. If Clara's program was accurate, Rosa's team would be expected to finish a foundation event, clean the ballroom, and return before dawn without being paid for the extra hours. My father reached for the program. "Put that down," he said. "Where did this come from?" "It came from the foundation. Who approved the venue donation?" My mother gave a small, impatient laugh. "Elena, not everything needs to become a management meeting. This one does." My father stepped closer. "You are making a scene. You told the manager to remove me because you walked into a donor event dressed like staff." I looked down at my shoes. "I am dressed like the person who owns the building and works here." For a moment, nobody moved. Not because the sentence was dramatic, because it was administrative, and administrative facts are difficult to argue with in a lobby full of paper. My father recovered first. "Get us the owner," he told Malik. "Now!" Malik glanced at the program in my hand. "Mr. Brooks, do you want the donor preview to continue under the current policy, or do you want me to pause the event while we verify the booking and staffing authorization?" "Do not be ridiculous." "Those are the 2 options." My mother turned to me. "Tell him to stop this." I had spent most of my life trying to stop things before they became uncomfortable. I had softened my successes, hidden promotions, and accepted the role of the daughter who was still finding herself because it allowed everyone else to remain certain of who they were. But the program in my hand was not a family misunderstanding. It was an operating risk with employees attached to it. "Malik," I said, "pause the preview for 10 minutes. Keep the donors in the library with coffee. No one starts setup until we confirm the file." My father stared at me. "You don't give orders here," Malik answered before I could. "She does." He turned to the receptionist. "Leia, move the donor group to the library and let Chef know the kitchen walkthrough is delayed. Tell the banquet team no one clocks out early for additional setup." My father looked from Malik to me. "What exactly is going on?" I placed the program on the desk between us. "You asked to speak to the owner." His expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "I am Elena Brooks," I said, "managing member of Morrow House, LLC. My mother gripped the folder more tightly. My father gave a short laugh that did not contain any humor. "You work here." "I own the property and the operating company." "Since when?" "Since the closing documents were filed in October 2023. He looked around the lobby, searching for someone who would tell him this was a joke. Malik did not move. Leia continued collecting the name cards. The florist lowered her eyes, but she did not leave. My father had spent decades believing that authority arrived in a certain kind of suit. He had never learned to recognize it in a woman carrying a clipboard. "You bought Morrow House?" my mother asked. "Yes." "With what money?" "Savings, a local acquisition loan, and the operating profits from my hotel work." My father looked at the program again. "This is Clara's gala." "Then Clara should have a signed venue agreement." "She has a commitment." "From whom?" He did not answer. The silence was not a victory. It was the first accurate record of the afternoon. I picked up the folder my mother had been carrying. She tried to hold on to it, but I did not pull. I simply waited. After a moment, she released it. Inside were donor seating charts, a vendor worksheet, and a staffing page printed on foundation letterhead. At the bottom of the staffing page, beneath a list of setup duties, someone had typed a note in gray. "Volunteer support. No overtime. Supervisors to release staff from the clock before foundation setup begins." I read the line aloud. Who wrote this? My mother looked at my father looked at the door to the library, and that was how I learned the afternoon was not about my shoes. It was about whether my family believed the people who worked for me were another thing they could promise away. The first time my parents treated my work as something that should remain invisible, I was 16. It was a foundation luncheon at a country club outside Kansas City. Clara was 14 and had been asked to stand beside Judith while donors toured the garden. My father introduced her as the future of the Brooks family. I was in the service corridor carrying a tray of empty glasses. I had not been hired for the event. I was helping because Judith said the caterer was short 2 hands and because Clara needed the family represented in photographs. When I came around the corner, my father saw me before the donors did. "Not through the main room," he said. "I need to take these to the kitchen." "Then use the back hall." I remember the exact way he said it. Not cruelly. That would have been easier to understand. He said it as if he were explaining traffic flow to a child. The back hall was narrower, darker, and lined with cardboard boxes. I carried the tray through it while my sister's voice floated from the garden beyond the glass doors. That night, Judith told me I should be proud to help. "Clara is good with people," she said. "You are good with practical things." At 16, I heard that as a compliment. It took me years to understand that my family had divided the world into people worth presenting and people worth using. I became very good at practical things. After college, I joined a riverfront hotel instead of joining my father's development office. He called it a temporary rebellion. Judith called it a phase. Clara told her friends I was trying hospitality. The hotel had 42 rooms, a leaking awning, and a front desk phone that rang whenever someone in the building made a mistake. My first week, a guest arrived after midnight to discover that her room had been given to someone else. The night manager blamed the reservation system. The reservation system blamed the night manager. I apologized, found an empty suite, moved the guest's luggage, and wrote down every step that had failed. The next morning, I asked why the system allowed 2 people to be assigned to one room. The manager told me not to worry about things above my pay grade. I worried about them anyway. I learned the booking software. I learned how to read a vendor contract. I learned that a hotel's profit could disappear through small choices no one wanted to claim. A maintenance call delayed. A shift extended without approval. A refund promised by someone who did not understand the rate policy. 3 years later, I was front desk supervisor. 5 years after that, I was running the property. Occupancy climbed because I stopped treating problems as personal insults and started treating them as systems. That lesson stayed with me. My parents never asked what I had learned. When I told them I had become general manager, my father said, "That is nice, Elena. Everyone needs someone who can keep the rooms turning over." When I told them I was looking at buying a property, my mother asked whether I had calculated the emotional cost of disappointing the family again. They did not know that I had already calculated everything else. The opportunity came from Margaret Hale, the former owner of a neglected inn near the old freight district. She stayed at my hotel for 4 nights while her own property was tied up in a refinancing dispute. She noticed that I knew the names of the housekeepers, the breakfast cook, and the maintenance contractor. On her last morning, she left a card beside the coffee machine. "Call me when you are ready to run a place whose problems have your name on them." I called 9 months later. Morrow House had 28 rooms, a ballroom with a cracked plaster ceiling, and a service wing that smelled of old linen even after the windows were opened. The bank considered it a liability. I saw a property where good operations could still matter. I used the savings I had built from 12 years of hotel work. A local lender financed the acquisition. Margaret kept a small minority interest for the first year and exited after the property stabilized. There was no inheritance, no hidden trust, and no family rescue. There was a loan payment every month. There were payroll obligations every Friday. There was a roof that needed replacing before winter. I learned the difference between owning a building and being responsible for every person whose life touched it. Morrow House reopened after 14 months of work. We repaired the ballroom instead of covering the ceiling with fabric. We kept the old reception desk and replaced the brass plate behind it. We created paid training shifts for staff who wanted to learn supervision. My parents came to the reopening. Graham stood in the lobby and told 3 donors that he had always believed the property had potential. Judith corrected the florist placement and asked whether the preservation committee had approved the color of the curtains. Clara took photographs beside the staircase. I let them stay because I believed a family could be invited into a place without being allowed to control it. That was my mistake. I never hid that I ran Morrow House. I answered operational questions, approved requests, and worked the front desk when the property needed me. My parents simply treated "runs the inn" as a job title. They assumed the capital belonged to Margaret Hale, a local partnership, or some investor who preferred to stay out of sight. No one asked who held the company. I stopped volunteering the answer because they wanted access to the building, not a conversation about the ownership documents. For the next year, my parents treated Morrow House as a family extension. They asked for rooms at reduced rates. They used the ballroom for committee meetings. They sent vendors to Malik with instructions that began, "Graham said this was fine." Malik always brought the requests to me. I always answered them in writing. Sometimes my parents accepted the answer. More often, they acted as if I had made a temporary decision they could revisit through someone else. When the Foundation Gala appeared on the program, I understood that the problem was no longer that they did not recognize my ownership. They recognized my operational authority when it was useful to borrow, but assumed the real ownership belonged somewhere else. Malik waited until the donors were settled in the library before he brought the event file to my office. The office was behind the reception desk, close enough to hear the muted movement of the preview, but far enough from the lobby that my father could not turn the doorway into another stage. Rosa Alvarez came with him. Rosa had been the banquet supervisor at Morrow House since the first month we reopened. She knew which staff member could carry a tray one-handed, which cook needed a written prep list, and which vendors would agree to a late delivery only if you called them before noon. She placed a thin folder on my desk. "This is everything we have," she said. Everything? Everything that came through the property office. The foundation sent the hold deposit and the draft request. They never sent an executed agreement. Malik opened the folder. The first page was a deposit receipt for $12,000. The words, "Refundable event hold," were printed beneath the amount. "Pending execution of venue agreement." The second page was the draft rate card Malik had emailed to Clara 3 weeks earlier. The ballroom rental was listed at the standard evening rate. Staffing was calculated separately. Kitchen preparation and security had separate charges. Nothing on the page said donation. The third page was a draft venue agreement with the signature lines blank. The fourth was Clara's vendor worksheet. The numbers had been crossed out and replaced with zeros. Ballroom, in kind. Kitchen preparation, in kind. Security, in kind. Hospitality staff, volunteer support. Morning reset, volunteer support. Malik opened the property calendar on his laptop. The date was not an empty square waiting for a family favor. It had a sequence attached to it. The donor preview, the evening ballroom turnover, the overnight cleaning window, and the wedding load-in scheduled for the following afternoon. The kitchen had a delivery slot. The florist had a staging slot. Rosa's team had a paid schedule that ended before the extra work began. "The hold kept the date visible," Malik said. "It did not authorize the event. It gave the foundation time to sign the agreement or release the date under the cancellation policy." I read the deposit receipt again. $12,000 looked large enough to make people assume ownership of the decision. On paper, it was only a refundable hold. It bought time, not permission. The agreement still required an authorized signature, a staffing plan, proof of insurance, and confirmation that the event could coexist with the wedding booking. Rosa opened the operations calendar beside the vendor worksheet. "The 4 paid hours were not set up," she said. "They were the work before setup. Room measurements, vendor calls, linen counts, the revised seating map, and a kitchen walkthrough." "So the cost is documented," I said. "Yes. And the 6 extra hours are still avoidable." That distinction was important to the record. If I allowed the gala to proceed and later claimed the staffing plan was wrong, I would be asking employees to carry the uncertainty. If I stopped it before setup, the foundation would face an inconvenient correction, but the workers would not be made responsible for a promise they had never approved. Malik scrolled to the insurance checklist. The foundation had supplied a certificate for the draft event, but the venue section still named Morrow House as a contribution rather than a contracted location. The file contained enough paperwork to make the program look finished, and not enough paperwork to make the event approved. "This is how these things become impossible to unwind," he said. "Everyone sees a packet and assumes someone else completed the missing page." I looked at Clara's email again. She had not asked whether the hold had converted into a booking. She had not asked whether the staffing plan had been approved. She had treated my father's assurance as a shortcut through every unanswered question. The shortcut had a cost, and the cost had names. Rosa tapped the last 2 lines. "The setup schedule adds 4 hours tonight," she said. "The cleanup and reset add 2 in the morning. The note says supervisors release the team from the clock after the regular shift." Who wrote it? Clara's assistant sent the worksheet. The note came from the foundation packet. Did anyone tell the staff they would be unpaid? Rosa looked at Malik. The staff were told it was a family event, she said. That is usually how the conversation starts. I looked again at the words volunteer support. No one volunteers for 6 hours after a scheduled shift because a donor wants the ballroom to look generous. Rosa's mouth tightened. I told my team not to clock out until we knew what was happening. Good. One of the foundation volunteers told them they were being difficult. Malik turned to the next page. It was an email from my father to Owen Bell, the foundation's board secretary and governance liaison for the event committee. I have cleared the property with the family. You may represent the venue contribution as an in-kind partnership. Elena will understand once the donor materials are out. There was no question mark after the last sentence. He had written it as if my understanding were a resource he could schedule. Below his name was an old signature block. Graham Brooks, former event committee chair, Brooks Family Futures Foundation. Not owner, not agent, former chair. I read the email aloud. Rosa crossed her arms. That is the part I was waiting for you to see. There is another email, Malik said. He pulled up a printed copy. 3 weeks earlier, Malik had sent Clara the draft agreement and rate card. Clara's response was 6 lines. Thanks, Malik. Dad has already cleared the family contribution. Please proceed with the donor materials so we don't miss the print deadline. We'll reconcile the details later. I leaned back in my chair. She had the rate card. Yes. She knew there was no signed agreement. Yes. And she told them to print the program anyway. Malik nodded. Rosa looked down at the staffing note. She may not have thought about the clock-out instruction. Maybe, I said, but she knew she did not have a signed venue agreement. That is enough. I had spent years defending Clara in my own head. She was impulsive, not malicious, sheltered, not cruel. She expected help because our parents had taught her that help was the natural shape of love. The email made the situation harder to simplify. Clara had been given the process. She had chosen to bypass it because my father said the family would approve. The next page was a staffing schedule. It showed Rosa's team assigned to setup from 3 p.m. until 7 p.m., then scheduled for cleanup from midnight until 2 in the morning. The regular paid shift ended at 6 p.m. The handwritten instruction was circled in red. Release from clock at 6. Family contribution. My hands went cold, but my voice did not change. How many people have already worked on this? Rosa and 2 banquet staff spent 4 paid hours preparing the room diagram and vendor calls, Malik said. Those hours are in payroll. Any unpaid hours yet? No, Rosa stopped the setup as soon as she saw the note. The difference mattered. We had a real harm, not a hypothetical one. Staff had been placed under pressure, and paid planning hours had already been incurred, but no one had yet been forced to work off the clock. Good, I said. We keep it that way. Rosa studied me. What are you going to do? I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:15. The correction deadline was 5. The evening gala was 5 hours away. I am going to give Clara one reasonable option, I said. Then I am going to make sure every person who works here is paid for the work they do. Malik closed the file. And your parents? I thought about my father's finger pointing at my shirt. I thought about the service corridor at 16, carrying glasses while Clara stood in the garden. I thought about the way my family had always turned labor into proof of love, then acted surprised when labor had a cost. They can decide whether they want a family privilege, I said, or a real contract. Rosa picked up the staffing sheet. I want to attach my name to this, she said. Not yet, I told her. First, let's give them a chance to correct it. She nodded, but she did not look relieved. Neither was I. Because once a family has printed your building and your workers into its promise, correcting the paper is the easy part. The hard part is deciding what you will do when they refuse to erase it. I found Clara in the library, standing beside a display of foundation photographs, and speaking to a man from the Kessler Family Trust. He was holding the printed program open to the page that described Morrow House as a donor contribution. "There you are," Clara said when she saw me. "Dad says you have stopped the preview." "The preview is paused. The gala is not approved." The man from the trust looked between us. He was old enough to understand family tension and young enough to hope it would resolve before it affected a donation. "We can give you privacy," he said. "That would be useful," I replied. He closed the program and left through the side door. Clara watched him go. "Do you know what you are doing?" she asked. "Yes. You are embarrassing me in front of the people who fund my work. You printed a program that promises my property and my employees. Our parents told me it was handled. You received the unsigned agreement and rate card. Malik sent them to you 3 weeks ago." Her face changed, but not into guilt. Into the irritation of someone whose private shortcut had become visible. "That was a draft." "Exactly. Dad said he had spoken with you." "He did not. He said you would not make an issue of it." "Then he was wrong." Clara folded her arms. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Find a technicality that proves you are smarter than everyone else." I looked at the program between us. A signed agreement is not a technicality. Paying people for their time is not a technicality. You could have asked. It is a family foundation. It is still a client. The phrase made her laugh once, sharply. "You want to charge your own sister for a room." "I want the foundation to pay for the room it promised to use." "You have more than enough money." "The issue is not whether I can afford to donate 6 hours of other people's labor." "Nobody said 6 hours." I took the staffing page from the folder and set it on the table. "This says 4 hours of setup and 2 hours of reset. It says volunteer support. It says no overtime. It tells supervisors to release staff from the clock." Clara stared at the note. "That was probably a draft." "So was the contract." Her shortcut had reached the end of the road. I slid a 1-page alternative across the table. Malik had prepared it while I was in the office. It offered the foundation a smaller reception in the library in North Terrace, with a paid staffing package, a shortened menu, and a clear end time. The ballroom would remain available for a paying wedding the next day. The foundation could keep its donor meeting, but it would not receive a fictitious gift from a property it did not own. "This is what I can approve," I said. "If you accept by 5, we can correct the program, notify the donors, and hold the reception tonight. No donated labor. No family branding on the venue page. The hold deposit will be applied to the smaller booking." Clara did not pick up the page. "You already decided to punish me." "I gave you a paid option." "You gave me a public demotion." "The original event was not approved." "Because you refused to approve it." "Because you did not ask." She pushed the page back toward me. "I am not moving my donors into a library like a child who got sent out of class." "Then move the gala to another venue." Her eyes narrowed. "You would really do that?" "Yes." "Tonight?" "Before the final vendor confirmations. You have time to tell the truth." She stood. "You do not understand how foundations work. I understand how promises work." Clara picked up the original program. "This is my event." "Then take responsibility for the venue you promised." She walked out without answering. My mother was waiting in the corridor. "You could have handled that privately," Judith said. "I tried." You made her feel small. "She printed a staffing plan that told employees to work off the clock." "That is not what she meant." "It is what the note says." Judith's gaze hardened. "Family events have always involved people helping each other. Helping is voluntary, and paid work is paid. Those are not interchangeable. You have become very formal. I became responsible for payroll. She looked past me toward the reception desk. Your father built this family's standing. Then he should not use my staff to maintain it. Judith lowered her voice. You are acting like we are strangers. You are asking me to treat a family event differently from every other client, while telling my employees to clock out. You are choosing employees over us. I thought of Rosa's face when she had read the staffing note. Not angry, tired. She had seen this kind of request before, and she knew how easily a request became a test of loyalty. No, I said. I am choosing not to make employees pay for your idea of family. Judith walked away. At 4:30, the sponsor called. The caller was a woman named Denise Kessler, whose trust had funded 3 of Clara's after-school programs. She spoke carefully, as if she had been told there was a disagreement, but not what kind. Clara says the venue is uncertain, Denise said. The ballroom was never contracted. Your father told several donors that the contribution was confirmed. He did not have authority to confirm it. If the event moves, some sponsors may withdraw. I understand. Can you not make an exception? I can offer the smaller paid reception. I cannot offer unpaid labor or a room that was never booked. There was a pause. You are the owner? Yes. And this is your sister's foundation? Yes. Then you understand how bad this looks. I understand how bad it looks when a family prints a promise before obtaining permission. Denise exhaled. I will speak with Clara. Please do. The deadline is 5. At 5:05, Clara sent one message to the Foundation group chat. The gala will proceed as printed. Morrow House is being unreasonable. Rosa forwarded me a screenshot. The correction window was closed. I opened the refund policy, confirmed the hold deposit terms, and called Malik. Cancel the unauthorized arrangement, I said. Return the hold deposit, stop all setup connected to the gala, pay every planning hour already worked. No one clocks out before their shift is complete. Malik was silent for a second. That will put Clara's event in a difficult position. She had a paid alternative. Understood. And send the Foundation the documents, program, hold receipt, unsigned contract, staffing note, and the alternative we offered. Do you want me to copy your parents? Copy everyone who received the program. My hand rested on the phone after the call ended. I had spent years believing that boundaries were private things. A sentence spoken softly in a kitchen, a request not to be interrupted, a decision to leave an argument before it became cruel. But a business boundary had to travel farther than the person who made it. It had to reach the people who were already planning around someone else's assumption. I sent the notice at 5:18. The words were plain. Morrow House did not authorize the donated venue or donated labor representation in the Foundation's materials. The refundable hold deposit will be returned under the attached policy. No staff member is authorized to work outside recorded paid hours. Any future event request must be submitted through the standard booking process. I did not mention my father. I did not mention my mother. I did not mention that the people who made the promise were related to me. The facts were enough. The first consequence arrived as a voicemail from my father. You have embarrassed this family, he said. Call me before you make this worse. The Foundation salvaged the evening through a contingency hold at a hotel across town. The trust had already reserved the room as a backup, and the caterer could serve the original menu there. It was not elegant, but it was possible. The gala happened without Morrow House. The second arrived from a preservation board contact who had never spoken to me directly. The message asked whether Morrow House had withdrawn from a community use commitment attached to its preservation grant. The third arrived from the lender. Lena Park's email was professional and short. A gala program had been forwarded to the bank with a note suggesting that Morrow House had committed the property to a community event and might be in breach of its operating covenants. Lena asked for a routine clarification call. I read the 3 messages in that order and understood what my father was doing. He could not force me to reopen the ballroom. He could make the cancellation look like a failure of stewardship. Malik came into my office with a legal pad. "The Foundation's event chair has called twice," he said. "They say the donor notice makes them look dishonest. They printed a promise before they had an agreement." "I know. Did anyone post online?" "Not from our side." "Keep it that way." He sat across from me. "Your father is telling people the inn is unstable. Then we will make the record stable." We laid the documents across the desk in chronological order. The initial inquiry from Clara, Malik's rate card, the unsigned draft contract, the refundable hold receipt. Clara's reply saying Graham had cleared the event. The vendor sheet with the zeros. The staffing note marked volunteer and no overtime. Graham's email to Owen. The payroll record showing 4 paid planning hours already incurred. The cancellation notice. We marked each document with a time and a source. The point was not to create a thicker file. It was to prevent the story from changing as it moved from the lobby to the lender to the foundation board. The program had a print date. The hold receipt had terms. The email had a sender and a recipient. The staffing note had an instruction that could be tested against payroll. Malik added the event calendar and the next morning wedding contract to the chronology. The wedding client had paid a deposit, submitted a load-in schedule, and received a written promise that the ballroom would be ready. That promise was real because it had passed through the normal process. It did not make the foundation event less important, it made the conflict concrete. 2 clients could not both receive the same room and the same labor under incompatible assumptions. "If anyone asks why we did not simply accommodate both," he said, "we show them the schedule." The schedule showed more than a conflict between my sister and a wedding party. It showed the order in which an operating business had to make promises. The foundation had a refundable hold and no executed agreement. The wedding had a signed contract, a paid deposit, and a confirmed load-in. The foundation's program had reversed that order in public. I added a separate page for what did not happen. No employee worked unpaid. No security contractor billed a release fee. No gala guest entered the Morrow House ballroom that night. No lender default occurred. The list looked almost defensive, but it kept the record from exaggerating the harm in either direction. The truth was serious without becoming theatrical. Staff had been pressured. Paid planning time had been used. A florist had incurred a documented cancellation fee. A public representation had been made without authority. That was enough to require correction. It did not require me to invent damages or turn my family into criminals. Malik placed a yellow tab beside the phrase family contribution. "This is the phrase they keep using," he said. "It makes it sound as if the building and staff are part of the foundation's donor package." "It was designed to do that." "Do you want me to respond to every person who received it?" "Send the correction to the same distribution list, nothing more," he nodded. "And the preservation board?" "I will handle the inquiry. Your father has known those people longer than you have. They do not need to like me. They need to read the covenant." The covenant was not a promise that Morrow House would host every event the Brooks family wanted. It required the property to remain open to approved community use under written terms, with safety, staffing, and access standards maintained. Canceling an unsigned gala arrangement did not violate it. The danger was not the document. The danger was the story around it. My father had built his reputation by making informal commitments sound permanent. A handshake became a promise. A promise became a community expectation. When someone asked for the paperwork, he treated the request as an insult. I called Lena. She joined the call from the bank's downtown office. "I want to be clear," she said. "This is a routine inquiry. No default notice has been issued." "Understood." The program was sent to us with a note suggesting a community use obligation. We need to know whether there is an executed event agreement. There is not. There is a refundable hold deposit pending execution. I can send the draft agreement, the policy, and the cancellation notice. Please do. The property is compliant with the operating covenant. Based on what you have described, canceling an unsigned event is not a covenant breach. We will confirm that in writing after review. Thank you. One other point, Elena. The lender cares about payroll compliance. If the staffing note really directs people to work off the clock, I want that documented as a risk you stopped, not an arrangement you accepted. I will send the payroll record and the note. Good. Keep your records together. Lena was not rescuing me. She was doing her job because my father had pulled the lender into a question he thought would frighten me. The record was working as it should. By evening, the bank sent a written clarification. Morrow House remained in compliance. The lender had no objection to the cancellation. The event hold had been refunded under policy. I printed the letter and placed it in the file. At 7, the foundation sent a demand through an attorney. The letter said I had used my ownership interest to retaliate against my parents, damaged Clara's charitable reputation, and interfered with an established community commitment. It asked that Morrow House honor the gala as printed or reimburse the foundation for the value of the promised venue and labor. I read the letter once. Then I sent it to our counsel, Mara Ellis, who had handled the Morrow House closing. Mara called 15 minutes later. They are trying to make this sound like a family dispute with a building attached, she said. What is it? A demand letter. It is intimidation and reputational pressure. There is no executed contract in the file. They want the ballroom. They want you to behave as if the original promise was real because too many donors have already seen it. What should we answer? Only the record. Ownership. No executed agreement. Refundable hold terms. The labor policy. The lender clarification. Ask them to identify the document that gave Graham authority. There is no such document. Then do not give them an emotional argument they can quote. Let the absence speak. Mara sent the response the next morning. It was less than 2 pages. Morrow House LLC did not authorize the representation that venue space or labor would be donated. The event hold was refundable pending execution of a contract and was returned under the stated policy. The staffing note directing clock-out labor is inconsistent with Morrow House policy. Please identify any document establishing Mr. Graham Brooks as an owner, agent, or authorized signatory. There was no mention of my father calling me an employee. There was no mention of Clara calling me jealous. The letter did not need the family history. It needed the structure that made the family history irrelevant to the contract. That afternoon, Rosa came to my office holding a yellow envelope. I found something in the old transition files, she said. Inside were records from 2 foundation breakfasts held at Morrow House before I bought the property. The previous owner had accepted the events at a reduced rate, then quietly absorbed the labor cost when Graham described the breakfasts as community partnerships. There were invoices with zeroed staffing charges. There were handwritten notes from a former banquet manager. Graham says the family will cover it. Do not ask for a separate labor line. The old owner had covered the cost, but the staff had still done the work. The difference was not justice. It was which person absorbed the loss. Rosa turned to the last page. It was an email from the first month after Morrow House reopened. Could you ask Elena to let the foundation team set up after clockout? Graham says this was always included. Rosa had replied, No. If there is additional work, please send a written request through payroll. The response from the sender was 1 sentence. Please don't make the Brooks family look difficult. Rosa's hands were steady, but her voice was not. I remembered the message, she said. I did not remember saving it. You do not have to attach your name to anything unless you want to. If I do not, they will say this happened once. It did happen more than once. Then I want them to say my name when they talk about it. I reached for the yellow envelope. We will keep it in the record. Not just in the record, Rosa said. At the review. That was the first time she said the word, review. The foundation board had not yet asked for one, but the documents were beginning to create a path toward it, and my father, who had spent his life turning informal power into private obedience, had finally made the mistake of putting his assumption in writing. The preservation request arrived the next morning from the city liaison assigned to Morrow House's historic preservation grant. I answered it with the hold receipt, the unsigned agreement, the staffing plan, and the event timeline. No approved community use event, no setup, and no gala at Morrow House. The covenant required written terms, safety review, and a staffing plan. It did not turn a family promise from a former committee chair into a public right of access. 2 days later, the liaison confirmed that the grant file and historic event permit were clean. Future community events would identify the authorized venue signatory. I asked that clarification to remain with the permanent grant correspondence, then added the same preservation and staffing checks to our event packet. Owen and Lena confirmed that the foundation and bank files would carry the corrected record. My father called before I could put down the phone. "You are making this look official," he said. "It is official. This was a family disagreement. You sent it to the lender and the preservation board." "I was trying to protect the foundation." "You were trying to make my cancellation look like a breach. Because you could have kept the event." "Not under those terms." "You keep hiding behind terms." "Terms are what keep the person with the loudest voice from deciding who pays." He went quiet. "You think the people on those boards will respect you because you have paperwork," he said. "No, I think the paperwork will protect the people who do not have your relationships." "You are punishing me. You are hearing the consequences of making a promise you could not keep." He ended the call. That evening, Malik and I rewrote the event authorization procedure. The old version had been designed for ordinary clients. It explained deposits, cancellation windows, staffing requests, and insurance requirements. It did not include a line that said family members were not exempt, because I had never believed we would need one. We added it, not as a sentence about my parents, as a sentence about authority. Only the managing member or a designated signatory may approve an event, donation, discount, staffing plan, or public representation of Morrow House. Family relationship, committee membership, prior patronage, and donor status do not create signing authority. Rosa read the draft and added a second line. No employee may be instructed to clock out and continue working. Any extension of a shift requires written consent and recorded compensation. She looked at me after she wrote it. "This is better than saying no one should do what Clara asked," she said, "because it protects the next person too." That is what policy is supposed to do. We posted the procedure in the staff room and added it to every event packet. The new form had a box for authorized signatory, a box for staffing budget, and a box confirming that employees had been informed of their paid hours. The first employee to sign the acknowledgement was a housekeeper named Nia, who had worked at Morrow House for 6 months. "Does this mean donors cannot change my schedule in the hallway anymore?" she asked. "It means they cannot change it without your supervisor and a written schedule." "And if they say it is for a good cause?" "Good causes still need accurate staffing." Nia nodded and signed. The action was small. No one outside the building saw it. But the event that had begun with my father calling me an employee had created a rule that made every employee more visible. Owen Bell called me the following Monday. The gala had been moved to a hotel across town. Clara's foundation had sent a corrected donor notice, but the first version had already circulated. The event happened without Morrow House. The sponsor stayed. The program was changed. 4 donors asked why the venue had disappeared. Owen did not ask me to explain the family. He asked whether I would provide the documents to the foundation board. What kind of meeting? I asked. A governance review, not a family mediation. Will Graham be there? Yes. Will Clara? Yes. Then Rosa needs the option to submit her statement directly. There was a pause. That is reasonable. And I will not attend a meeting designed to produce an apology before anyone discusses the records. Understood. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday in a conference room at the Foundation's office. I arrived with Mara, Malik, and Rosa. Owen sat at the head of the table with a laptop open in front of him. 2 other board members were present. One who had funded the Foundation's youth program, and another who served as its treasurer. Owen had convened the Foundation's 3-member governance committee, which the bylaws authorized to review event committee misconduct. All 3 members were present. Graham sat across from me in a gray suit. Judith sat beside him. Clara was at the end of the table, looking tired and angry. Graham did not look at Rosa. Owen began with procedure. The question before the board is whether the Foundation represented control over a venue and labor it had not legally contracted to use, whether any committee member used his position to create that representation, and what documented costs resulted. My father shifted in his chair. This is an absurd way to discuss a family event. Owen looked at him. It is a Foundation event. That was the first boundary of the meeting. He explained that each person would have a chance to identify what they knew, what they had approved, and what they had assumed. The board was not deciding whether Elena was a loving daughter or whether Graham had spent years serving the city. It was deciding whether the Foundation's process had allowed a person without signing authority to promise a venue and labor. Clara asked whether the board could discuss the donor pressure before reviewing the staffing page. We will, Owen said. But pressure does not establish authority. It explains urgency. It does not change the file. That sentence steadied the room. The board could acknowledge the Foundation's risk without using that risk to transfer the cost to Morrow House. The sponsors had expected a gala at one location. The Foundation had needed to relocate. Those were real consequences. They were not permission retroactively granted. The treasurer asked me whether Morrow House had ever offered a family discount. Yes, I said. When it was approved in writing and the staffing line was separate. So the family was not barred from using the property. No, they were barred from treating access as automatic. Owen wrote that answer down. He did not look satisfied or disappointed. He looked like someone trying to make the distinction durable enough to survive the meeting. Mara distributed the documents in order. She did not dramatize them. She described what each one established. The hold receipt showed a refundable deposit pending a signed agreement. The draft contract showed the rate card and staffing charges. The vendor worksheet removed those charges and labeled them in kind. The staffing note directed supervisors to release employees from the clock before setup and cleanup. The email from Malik showed that Clara had received the contract and rate card 3 weeks before the donor materials were printed. Clara stared at the copy in front of her. I thought Dad had handled the approval, she said. You wrote that he had, Mara replied. You also told the team to proceed with the donor materials. I did not tell anyone to work for free, Rosa spoke from the end of the table. The staffing note did. Clara turned toward her. That was a draft. So was the contract, Rosa said. No one answered. Rosa had prepared a statement. She held 1 page, but she did not read from it at first. I supervise the banquet team at Morrow House, she said. When the Foundation packet arrived, it listed setup and morning reset as volunteer support. The schedule added 6 hours beyond the regular shift. The note told supervisors to clock people out after their regular hours. I stopped the setup before anyone worked unpaid. The treasurer leaned forward. Were employees already affected? 4 paid planning hours had been worked. Those hours were in the payroll record. No unpaid hours were recorded because we stopped the request. Why did the note exist? Rosa looked at Graham. Because people in this family have been told that family events are different. My father finally met her eyes. That is not fair. It is accurate, Rosa said. She described the 2 breakfasts from the previous owner's period. The old owner had absorbed the staffing cost. After Elena bought the inn, Rosa had refused a similar request and been told not to make the Brooks family look difficult. I am not saying every person at the foundation knew, she said. I am saying the request had a history. It was not an accident in a spreadsheet. Clara's face had changed. I did not know about the old breakfasts. You knew about the unsigned contract, I said. She looked at me. I knew Dad said it was handled. You knew Malik sent you the rate card. Yes. You knew the donor program was being printed before the contract was signed. Clara lowered her eyes. Yes. The admission did not make her a monster. It made her responsible for a choice. Owen turned to my father. Mr. Brooks, what gave you authority to promise the property? I have been connected to Morrow House for years. That was not my question. Elena is my daughter. That is not authority. My father looked at me. I knew she would approve. You never asked, I said. Because this was a family event. You told donors it was a donation. You told staff to work off the clock. You used my name as if it were a signature. His jaw tightened. You could have said yes. You could have asked. The room went quiet, but it did not freeze. Owen continued to turn pages. The treasurer marked a line on his notes. The process moved because the facts did not need a performance. The board discussed actual costs. Morrow House had incurred 4 paid planning hours. A florist had held a delivery slot and charged a documented cancellation fee after the foundation withdrew. A security contractor had reserved 2 staff members and released them without charge. The board did not invent a future payroll debt. It listed what could be proven. Owen read the proposed action. The board will remove Graham Brooks from the event committee effective today. The foundation will adopt independent procurement review for venue commitments. It will reimburse Morrow House for the documented florist cancellation fee and the 4 paid planning hours already incurred. Any future event will use a signed contract and a separate staffing budget. My father pushed his chair back. You are removing me over a misunderstanding. We are removing you because you represented authority you did not have, Owen said. Clara did not defend him. That was her second choice, and it mattered. She looked at the staffing note again. I should not have told them to print the program, she said. My mother turned toward her. Clara. No, Mom. Clara's voice shook. I had the rate card. I saw that it was unsigned. I thought Dad could fix it because he always has. Judith closed her eyes. The board approved the action. Owen asked the treasurer to record the reimbursement as a payment to Morrow House, not as a second payroll payment to the employees. Morrow House had already paid the staff correctly. The foundation was reimbursing the business for the documented labor cost it had caused. The distinction kept the remedy accurate and kept the workers out of another argument about whether their wages counted as a gift. The board also required that future donor programs identify the venue as pending until a signed agreement and authorized staffing plan were on file. That rule applied to every foundation event, not only to Clara's Gala. It was the kind of consequence that could survive the next committee chair and the next family explanation. No one was arrested. No bank accounts were frozen. No newspaper arrived to explain my family to the city. The foundation had been required to look at its own paperwork and pay the costs it had actually caused. That was enough for the moment. The family came back to Morrow House after closing. There were no donors in the library. No florist was carrying boxes through the lobby. No volunteers stood near the desk, waiting to be introduced to someone important. The building was quiet in the practical way it became quiet after a shift ended. The lights were lower. The coffee station had been cleaned. Somewhere in the service wing, a dishwasher finished its cycle and clicked into silence. Malik had asked whether I wanted security present. "No," I said. "I want the doors locked after they leave." Rosa sat beside him in the small reception side office. I kept the door open because the room was controlled, not secret. The original removal order had happened 6 feet from that desk. I wanted the meeting to return to the place where my father had tried to turn me into an employee, but I did not want an audience. Before they arrived, Malik and I agreed on the order. Rosa would speak about the labor record. I would state the access policy. Clara could answer for the foundation. Graham and Judith could respond, but neither of them would be allowed to turn the meeting into a debate about my childhood. If the conversation became circular, Malik would end it. That plan was not a punishment. It was the same kind of preparation we used for a difficult vendor, a safety concern, or a client who believed a deposit was a favor. The difference was that I knew the people who might try to make the process personal. Graham entered first. Judith followed, with a folder in both hands. Clara came last. She looked as if she had slept in her clothes. My father stopped when he saw the chairs. "This is not how I expected this conversation to happen," he said. "It is not a conversation about expectations," I replied. "It is a meeting about access and the record." His mouth tightened. Judith placed the folder on the table. "We came to resolve this." What does resolve mean? The gala is over, I know. Clara lost the original venue. She used another venue. Several donors are asking questions. Then they should receive the corrected notice. Judith looked at Rosa. "We have already reimbursed the costs." Rosa nodded once. "The florist fee and the planning hours were paid." My mother looked relieved, as if payment had closed the emotional account. "Then what more do you want?" she asked. "I want you to stop calling the inn a family asset." Graham gave a bitter laugh. "It is our daughter's property." "That is not the same thing. You are making a distinction without a difference. It is the difference between asking and promising." Rosa opened the staffing record. "The Foundation's donor notice is corrected," she said. "But the note that instructed staff to clock out was never corrected in the internal packet." Clara's face tightened. "That note was not used," she said. "It was circulated," Rosa replied. 3 staff members read it. One of them asked whether refusing would affect her hours. Clara looked at her hands. "I did not know that." "You could have asked," I said. Clara looked at me. "I know." That was different from the answer she had given at the donor preview. Graham shook his head. "You are all treating a planning mistake like a moral crime. You told people you had authority over the building. I thought you would approve it. You did not ask. Because you would have said yes if you were not trying to prove a point. I offered Clara a paid alternative. A smaller room. An authorized booking." The distinction landed between us. Rosa spoke before my father could answer. "The ballroom was not the only issue." Graham turned toward her. "You are staff. This is a family matter." Malik stood. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "that sentence is why Rosa is in this room." My father stared at him. Rosa did not raise her voice. "When you call our labor family support, you make it difficult to say no. You make it sound as if wages are a personal insult. When the note said no overtime, I knew exactly what would happen. Someone would ask us to clock out. Someone would tell us the foundation was important. Someone would say Elena would understand." Clara looked at her. "I would not have asked you to work for free. You told them to proceed with the materials. I thought the staffing would be handled." "Handled by whom?" Clara had no answer. Rosa closed the staffing folder. That is the problem. The work is always handled by someone whose name does not appear in the program. The room stayed quiet, but it remained a room. The clock continued above the doorway. The building's heat came on with a soft mechanical click. I looked at the 3 members of my family. Here is the policy from now on, I said. The Foundation can book Morrow House through the same rate card as every client. A contract must be signed before a program is printed. Staffing must be approved separately. Overtime requires written consent and recorded pay. No one will be asked to clock out and continue working because the event is connected to my family. Judith's voice was quiet. You would put that in writing against us? It is in writing for everyone. You do not trust us. Trust is not a substitute for a contract. My father leaned forward. You have made your point. You own the inn. We understand. Do you? Yes. Then you understand that the Foundation cannot use Morrow House for the next gala under the old arrangement. Clara swallowed. I understand. And if you want to book it in the future, you will submit a request through Malik. Not through Dad? Not through Dad. Graham pushed his chair back. This is humiliating. The donor preview was public because you made it public. You could have corrected me quietly. I tried to correct the contract quietly. You told the manager to remove me. He looked at the reception desk through the open doorway. I thought you worked for the property. You thought I belonged to the people who ran the property. I did not know. You did not look. The sentence was not an accusation I had planned. It came from the same place as the service corridor, but it was smaller now. Less like a wound and more like an accounting line. Judith opened her folder. There is a corrected donor notice, she said. It says the venue was listed without authorization and that the Foundation is responsible for its own event costs. Who signed it? Clara and I. And the future fundraisers? I will not describe Morrow House as a Brooks family venue. Thank you. She looked at me. That is all you have to say? For the notice, yes. Her eyes filled with a frustration that was not entirely anger. You used to want us to notice you. I wanted you to know me. Is that not the same thing? No. The difference was the whole reason I had built a life they had not been invited to narrate. My father stood. We are leaving. Clara did not move immediately. She looked at Rosa. I am sorry. Rosa did not answer at once. What are you sorry for? Clara's eyes dropped to the staffing folder. For assuming the work would be there because I wanted the event to look generous. Rosa nodded. That is a place to start. Clara stood. The 3 of them walked through the lobby. At the desk, my father stopped and looked at the brass plate bearing the Morrow House name. He touched it with one finger. You chose this name, he said. The building already had it. You could have changed it. I could have. Why didn't you? I looked through the front windows at the dark street, the old brick facades, and the lamps that made the sidewalk look warmer than it was. Because I wanted the place to belong to the neighborhood, I said, not to the family. He removed his hand from the plate. They left without another argument. Malik locked the front doors. Rosa remained beside me at the desk. You all right? She asked. I don't know yet. That is honest. I am trying it out. She smiled slightly. The staff are going to need the new policy tomorrow. I will have it drafted. And the training schedule? What training schedule? You said we were going to build a supervisor pathway. You said staff should not have to wait for someone to notice they were already doing the work. I had said that during our spring planning meeting, before my parents turned the gala into a crisis. The idea had been in the operating notes, but had not yet become a formal program. You remembered, I said. Someone has to. This time I wrote it down. Judith sent the corrected donor notice to every person who had received the original program. She did not call it a misunderstanding. She did not say the event had been changed because of a family disagreement. She wrote that the foundation had circulated venue and staffing information before formal authorization, and that future partnerships would be confirmed through written agreements. The notice was not an apology to me. It was more useful than one. 2 days later, she asked to meet at a coffee shop near the public library. I almost declined. Then I remembered the boundary I had given Graham. If they wanted contact, they could ask, without using staff, donors, or civic connections to force it. Judith arrived early. She had no folder this time. "I sent the notice," she said when I sat down. I saw it. "Your father says it makes him look like he lied." He represented authority he did not have. "He says he believed you would agree." Belief is not permission. She held both hands around her coffee cup. "I used to think family meant you did not need permission. Family can mean you ask because you know the answer matters." Her mouth pressed into a line. "You sound like someone who has never needed anything from anyone." I needed many things. I just learned not to call them gifts when they came with control. That sentence hurt her. I could see it. But hurt was not the same as harm, and I was no longer responsible for making every truth painless. "I thought you were rejecting us," she said. "I was rejecting the role you gave me. The difficult daughter. The useful daughter, the one who could carry trays, solve problems, and absorb costs without changing the picture." She looked out the window at the buses passing the library. "Your father did not start that way." "I know. After the recession, he became afraid of losing everything. He started believing that if the family looked weak, people would take advantage of us. So he took advantage first." She flinched. "That is not what I wanted. But you followed him." "Yes." It was the first time my mother admitted anything without turning it into an explanation. She reached into her purse and took out a single sheet of paper. "I stepped down from the Preservation Fundraiser Committee," she said, "not because anyone asked me to. Because I realized I had been presenting Morrow House as part of the Brooks family story. It is not." I read letter. "You do not have to do this for me. I am doing it because I did it." That distinction mattered. I folded the letter and returned it. "Then I accept the correction." She looked at me for a long time. "Do you accept my apology?" "I accept that you are beginning to understand the damage. I am not ready to turn that into restored access." Her eyes lowered. "Your father will not like that?" "He does not have to." "He wants to see you." "He can ask me himself." The next week he did. He came to my office without calling the foundation, the lender, or a board member. Malik told me Graham was in the lobby, alone, holding no program and no folder. "Send him in," I said. He entered slowly. The office looked different when he was not filling it with instructions. He stood near the chair instead of taking it. "You can sit," I said. He did. For several seconds, he looked at the framed operating plan on the wall, the staffing schedule, and the floor map that marked the new training kitchen. "You are changing the annex," he said. "We are opening a hospitality training kitchen. For the staff. For staff and local workers who want supervisory training." He nodded. "Your mother says you are not letting me come to the inn." "You can come as a client under the policy." "That is not what she means." "I know." His hands rested on his knees. "I lost the committee position." "Yes." "The board said I used my title to make a promise." "You did." "I thought I was helping Clara." "You were helping her avoid asking." He looked toward the window. "When you said you owned the place, I felt foolish." "You were wrong about who owned it." "It was more than that." He rubbed one hand over his mouth. "I built a life around being the person who could open doors. I knew people. I knew who to call. I thought that was what made me valuable." "It made you influential." And when you stopped needing me, I decided you were ungrateful." I did not answer. That was easier than admitting I had not learned who you became. The office clock marked another minute. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "A chance to repair it." "Repair requires more than seeing the deed." "I know. You cannot contact staff to arrange access. You cannot use my name in a civic promise. You cannot describe the inn as family property. If you want to speak with me, ask me directly." He nodded. "How often?" "Once a quarter, in a neutral place, no foundation business." "Quarterly. For now." He accepted that without bargaining. "Your sister wants to apologize," he said. "She already did. She wants to book the inn next year. Then she can send Malik a request." He gave a tired half smile. "You really mean that?" "Yes. You sound like your mother when she has made up her mind." "My mother taught me that rules were how people protected their place." "And now?" "Now I use rules to protect people who do not have your name." He looked down. "I am sorry," he said. The apology was small. It did not contain a defense. It did not ask me to tell him he was a good father. I believed he meant it. Believing him did not mean giving him the keys. "That is a start," I said. He stood. At the door, he paused. "Do you still want us there?" I thought about the question. "I want you to be capable of being there without taking it over." He nodded. "I will try." "Trying has to be visible to the people you affected." "I know." He left the office. I watched him cross the lobby through the glass wall. He stopped at the front desk, spoke to Leia, and walked out through the same doors he had used to command Malik. He did not ask her to call anyone. That was a small change. Small changes were the only kind I trusted. The following afternoon, Clara came back alone to collect the Foundation's remaining event boxes. She found Rosa in the staff room, reviewing the revised overtime procedure. "I wanted to tell you something," Clara said. Rosa closed the binder. "What?" "The Foundation reimbursed Morrow House for those 4 planning hours. I asked Owen to list the labor costs separately so nobody could describe it as donated." Rosa nodded. "That is correct." Clara looked at the binder. "Can I read the policy?" "You can read it. You cannot approve it." "I know." Rosa handed it to her. Clara stood near the window, turning pages. When she reached the line about family relationship not creating signing authority, she stopped. "Did Elena write this because of me?" "She wrote it because the policy was missing." "That feels like the same thing." "It can be both." Clara placed the binder back on the table. "I want to book the inn for next year's gala." "Then send the inquiry through the Foundation's procurement process." "Not through you?" "I am the banquet director. I can review the event once the request is authorized." Clara nodded. "I will do it correctly." Rosa picked up her pen. "That is the only way I will believe you." Clara left with the boxes. Rosa returned to the training binder. No one applauded. The correction did not need applause to be real. I understood then that a repaired relationship would not be measured by who returned to the ballroom. It would be measured by who could enter the building without treating another person's time, authority, or work as a family entitlement. That was the standard I intended to keep. Not as punishment, and not as proof of victory, but as the ordinary condition for doing business with anyone who entered Morrow House. Rosa became banquet director in the fall. The title came with a salary increase, authority over staffing, and a written pathway for anyone on the team who wanted to move into supervision. The new policy required written event authorization, a separate staffing budget, and overtime consent before any shift was extended. No supervisor could release an employee from the clock while asking that employee to continue working. The first time we trained the new supervisors, Rosa stood beside the old reception desk with a clipboard in one hand. "What do you do if a donor says the work is part of the family contribution?" she asked. One of the trainees answered, "Ask for the contract." "And if the contract is unsigned, stop and escalate. And if someone says Elena will approve it later?" The trainee looked at Rosa. "Get written approval before scheduling staff." Rosa smiled. "Good." The training kitchen opened in the annex 2 months later. It was not a glamorous room. It had stainless counters, a whiteboard, 2 old ovens, and enough space for 8 people to work without bumping elbows. We used it to teach inventory, scheduling, vendor negotiation, and the parts of hospitality that never appeared in a donor photograph. Margaret Hale visited on opening day. She stood near the door while Rosa showed the trainees how to read a banquet labor estimate. "You kept the building's name," Margaret said. "I did. And changed what it means." I looked through the doorway at the trainees comparing schedules. The building was never the difficult part. Clara's foundation held its next gala at a civic theater. The program listed the venue as contracted, the staff as paid, and the schedule as subject to written approval. Clara sent me a copy without asking me to attend. At the bottom of the email she wrote, "I read the contract this time." I replied, "Good." It was not a reconciliation. It was a line of communication that did not demand a performance. Judith continued to meet me at the coffee shop once a quarter. Sometimes she brought news about Clara. Sometimes she brought nothing. She stopped asking whether Morrow House could donate a room. She stopped referring to the inn as ours. Graham came to the second quarterly meeting without a suit jacket. He asked about the training kitchen and listened when I explained the staffing pathway. He did not ask to tour the inn. At the third meeting, he told me he had refused a friend who wanted an introduction to one of my vendors. "I told him to contact the office," he said. "What did he say?" "That I had changed." "Had you?" He considered that. "I am learning not to call access a relationship." That was the closest he had come to an apology that included behavior. On a cold Saturday morning, several months after the donor preview, I found the corrected Gala program in the mail. The cover had been redesigned. Clara's photograph was smaller, the donor list was accurate. Morrow House did not appear anywhere, except in a line on the final page. "Previous venue request withdrawn. Morrow House is not available without a signed agreement and approved staffing plan." I placed the program in the operations file, not because it proved I had won, because it proved the boundary had become policy. Then I walked through the inn. Leah was teaching a new receptionist how to record a special request without promising what the property could not provide. Malik was checking the paid schedule for the next wedding. Rosa was in the training kitchen, explaining why a beautiful event could still be badly managed. The building was full of work. Not the invisible labor my family had once treated as a family gift. It was visible, named, and paid, with a next step for people who no longer had to disappear behind someone else's celebration. I stopped beside the reception desk where my father had once pointed at me and asked for the owner. The brass plate behind it caught the morning light. I did not need my parents to recognize my name. I needed the people who worked here to know that their time belonged to them. And I needed to know that I would never again confuse being invited into a room with being responsible for everyone else's comfort inside it. By 11, the front doors opened for the first wedding guests. Leah straightened the welcome cards, Malik checked the ballroom, and Rosa reviewed the paid schedule. No one asked who the building belonged to. They knew what mattered. Who had authority, who had consented, who would be paid, and what would happen when a promise was made without them. The first new supervisor from the training pathway was Nia. She took responsibility for a Monday luncheon 3 weeks after the policy was posted. The client was a local association with a respected chair and a habit of changing menus at the last minute. When the chair asked Nia to keep 2 staff members after their scheduled shift without updating the staffing plan, Nia did not apologize. She opened the event packet. I can add the hours, she said. I need written approval and the updated labor cost. The chair stared at her. We have always handled this informally. Morrow House does not handle it informally anymore. Nia called Rosa, who confirmed the procedure. The client approved the additional cost. The staff stayed. They were paid. The luncheon ended on time. When Nia told me what happened, she expected praise. I gave her something more useful. Write down what worked, I said. The next supervisor should not have to invent the answer. She added the example to the training binder. That binder grew through the winter. It held sample contracts, corrected invoices, staffing scenarios, and the names of people who had once been told that professionalism meant absorbing a loss without complaint. I kept the original Gala staffing note in a separate file. Not because I wanted to remember my parents' humiliation. I wanted to remember the exact shape of the assumption we had changed. They had not only assumed that I would say yes, they had assumed that other people would pay for the answer. Morrow House no longer operated on that assumption.